Welcome to the Mid-America PTTC podcast, where we are a community of change leaders and prevention catalysts that strive to empower individuals and communities to promote safe, healthy, and drug-free communities across our region. We're honored to have you as a member of our PTTC community. Thanks for listening and keep up the great work.
Every single one of us is a leader and could be a leader.
It started with a local coalition in our county.
Strategies you know, but stories you don't.
Data is the currency of prevention.
We want to reduce the negative and we want to promote the positive.
Collaboration is the only way to move the prevention needle.
About connecting the research with the practitioner.
Put something out there that was kind of off the wall and create a community of prevention.
It's a passion, it's a real love to try to help make our world a little bit better, a little bit happier, small pieces at a time.
It's said an overnight success takes 16 years.
If we didn't plan for the change, but if we didn't help orchestrate it, then change is going to be upon us.
When it comes to the spiff, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Because the real power is in the process.
Ultimately, all of us want success in the work we're doing. We don't want to do mindless work. Proactive, participatory planning promotes positive, preventive progress.
This is the Mid-America PTTC podcast. I'm your host, Dave Clausen, and I am the director of the Mid-America Prevention Technology Transfer Center. This is episode 15, and today we'll be talking about cannabis. Our guest is Officer Ryan Snow. Ryan serves full-time as a police officer with a large university police department where he educates the community about DUI and drug-related issues. He is a certified drug recognition expert instructor and has completed hundreds of hours of training related to drugs and the impacts they have on the human body. As a police officer, Ryan has firsthand knowledge of the dangers that drugs bring to communities. He has spoken at numerous national and state conferences on topics related to drugs, and he has also developed training opportunities for campuses and delivered those classes at colleges and universities across the nation. Ryan's work has been featured in webinars, newspapers, television, and educational articles. And prior to law enforcement, Ryan graduated with a bachelor's degree in education and a master's degree in educational administration. Now, before we get into the content, we'd like to thank our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. And a quick note, although funded by SAMHSA, the contents of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. Without further ado, let's get into the content. All right, I'd like to welcome Ryan Snow to the podcast. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
During my introduction, I mentioned that you are a drug recognition expert, or DRE. Would you mind sharing what all that entails?
Yeah, sure. Back in 2013, I put in a request to go to the Drug Recognition Expert School or training. I was extremely lucky to be granted that opportunity. I went out to classroom training, a 2-week period of time, and then moved from that and did some evaluations on individuals that were actually under the influence of some type of drug. And the training basically trains you to be able to identify different signs and symptoms within somebody that's ingested a drug and be able to identify what type of drug that they've ingested or what category of drug they've ingested. So I may not be able to tell you that somebody has been doing cocaine, but I would be able to identify that they were under some type of a stimulant. And I kind of have come up with my own way of referring to the DRE school as kind of the PhD of training when it comes to impaired driving, because when officers are hired during the academy, they'll attend the 24-hour NHTSA training, so the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration training. It's a 24-hour program that we teach all officers in the academy to help them identify when somebody is too impaired to be driving. But most of that focuses on alcohol And when they get out, they have the opportunity to take a class called A-Ride, which is the Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement class. And that's a 16-hour class, 2-day class, to give them a better idea of identifying people that are impaired based not only on alcohol, but also drugs as well. And so it's kind of a crash course for identifying when somebody may be under the influence of some type of a drug and how to kind of go about that process. I kind of refer to that. So the 24-hour class would be like your bachelor's degree of impaired driving. The A-Ride class would kind of be like your master's degree of impaired driving. And then the DRE school is basically the PhD, where we really break down all the different drugs, signs and symptoms, how they impact the body, and things like that, so we can give officers a really good idea of how to process if they come across somebody that's impaired by, a type of drug.
Wonderful, wonderful. And really, on top of that PhD, you're also a DRE instructor. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so a couple years back, actually, I was approached by the DRE coordinator and asked if I wanted to take part in the instructor program, and I absolutely accepted that opportunity. And so now I'm one of the instructors that will actually teach the new DREs as they sign up to go through the course. I will travel to wherever the course is and teach some blocks or segments on the different drugs and how they impact the human body and what kind of changes you'll see and that type of thing. And I also will assist them as they go through their process where they have to do evaluations on individuals that are actually under the influence of some type of a drug. And I'll stand there and kind of help them through that process. These are their first kind of introduction to doing the evaluation on an actual person. And so I'm there to kind of coach them along to that process and come up with the correct decision based on what they're seeing.
A wealth of knowledge and experience. Can't wait to dive into our episodes and learn more about some of the current drug trends. Let's jump right in. Okay, so today let's dive into the topic of cannabis. And I'd like to really start off with breaking down the THC concentrations over the years. How have you seen things change, Ryan?
Yeah, so the THC concentrations have changed tremendously over the last few years, but even prior to that, in the 1990s, 2000s, somewhere in there, early 2000s, the THC concentration we would see from your typical cannabis would be, maybe 4 to 6, 8%, somewhere in there. It wouldn't be very high at all. But as the different states have started to legalize and there's bigger business in this, they've come up with new systems, they've come up with new ways to actually increase the potency of the THC within the cannabis itself. And so now we're starting to see everything from upwards of 25 to 35% when you're talking about your regular flower bud cannabis, and then it goes up from there. So if we're talking about concentrates, you're looking closer at like a 60 to 80% range of the concentrates, depending on what type of concentrate you have or who develop it. And then we also have concentrations now all the way up to 99% THC content, which is tremendous jump from where we were. And so if to kind of put that into context, back in 1990, if I was to smoke just a regular joint, I'd be pulling in 4% THC content of that one joint. But fast forward to now, when we're talking flower bud cannabis, that same flower bud cannabis, you're talking anywhere about 25% THC content. So you're talking upwards of 5-6 times the amount of THC content is available within that flower bud cannabis. And now we're also seeing a shift from joints to blunts, which are bigger than the joints that everyone kind of got comfortable with back in the 90s and before that. Now we're talking about blunts, which provide a larger space, and they're rolling them much larger, and they're ingesting much more THC than they were before. And so to kind of equate that, back in 1990, you'd be talking, someone would have to smoke 5, 6, 7 joints back to back to back to back all the way through to get the same THC content or the same effects that they're receiving from one blunt now.
That jump is incredible. You mentioned concentrates. Could you tell us a little bit more about what those are?
Yeah, sure. So concentrates are basically just a way to isolate certain chemical compounds within the cannabis plant itself. And so two of the most common people talk about, or chemical compounds that they try to isolate that people would know or maybe be familiar with, would be CBD versus THC. And CBD is cannabidiol, and that is the chemical compound within the cannabis plant that actually lacks or reduces the high effect that you would receive if you ingested the drug. THC is what everybody's pretty much after. That is the active ingredient within the cannabis plant itself that creates that high effect when you ingest it. And so that's what the majority of people are looking for, is to basically feel high, when they're ingesting the plant. And so the concentrate aspect comes from being able to isolate the THC from the chemical, from the plant itself, to be able to impact the amount of THC somebody can take into their body. So one of the most common ways that people create a concentrate would be what's known as keef. And so keef is what you find, it's like basically the powder consistency or shake created from after you grind cannabis. So if you put the flower bud cannabis into a grinder, it goes through a couple different filter screens, and at the very bottom of that, you are left with a very fine powder, and that's keef. And keef can hold a higher value of the THC based on how it's broken down. And so when we're talking about concentrates, it's one of the lower forms or THC potencies of the concentrates, but it is there, and it's very easily made or produced. And then what I find most commonly is people will essentially save their keef until they have enough to either sprinkle it into a blunt or smoke it out of a bowl or something like that. And then that will give them the higher concentration. Past that, we have things that people may have heard of, like wax or oil. Shatter is one that's pretty common now. And these are all just different forms of developing or extracting the THC from the plant to give it the higher concentration when you're ingesting it.
Okay, so there are different types of the concentrates, as you said, everywhere from keef to oil and shatter. What are some ways these concentrates are consumed?
With the keef, you can pretty much consume that the same type of a way that you would flower or bud. And like I said, a lot of times it's sprinkled on top of the flower or bud to kind of give it an extra kick. And they smoke it the same way that they would smoke, anytime. With some of the other ways, you may have heard of dabbing. That is a very, very common way of ingesting cannabis. And that they have what's known as an oil rig, where they, basically you superheat a component of the oil rig, and that's called the nail, and you use a torch to superheat it, make it like a red hot consistency, and then you take just a little piece of the wax or shatter or whatever you want to call it, or whatever they're marketing it as. You take just a little piece of that and you actually dab that onto that nail, where it will melt it down extremely quickly, vaporize it, turn it into a vapor, and then the consumer actually takes that into their body as a vapor. And that's probably the most common way that I'm seeing. But when we're talking about ways of ingestion, especially with THC now, we have to expand into edibles, patches like transdermal patches that people can put on their skin, drinks, any kind of, really, I always talk about it now as in the sky's the limit. When you're asking to somebody that may be under the influence, how they consumed their cannabis. I used to be very comfortable with when did you last smoke? And now that's not the case anymore. I go through a variety of questions that I ask people, not only when did they last smoke, and if they say I haven't, then I go into questions about vaping, edibles, the sky's the limit again. How did you ingest your cannabis is now a pretty common question that I ask people that I come across.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought up the shift in language. That's a good takeaway for those of us working in the prevention field. What we're asking and how we're asking it can have a big impact on the responses we get. Now, you did mention vaping.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of information being put out about that now. Could you go into a little more detail or tell us a little more about what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, just recently it's really hit the scene, I guess, and lots of people are starting to pay attention to it because there's been quite a few reports of illnesses and some deaths associated with vaping, and they're trying to find the link between, is this vaping of nicotine, the e-cigarettes. They're starting to put some regulations, or at least attempting to put some regulations on the flavoring that they're including with e-cigarettes and how that may influence younger individuals to start getting into that way of using, or just in general ingesting nicotine. And so some of the things, like the USA Today just released an article not that long ago that said that they had about 380 confirmed or probable cases of vaping related lung illnesses, and it spanned across 36 states. So we're not just talking about the states that have legalized for medical marijuana or recreational marijuana or anything like that, but they span across 36 states. And so far 6 people have actually lost their lives to lung related illnesses. And one of the main factors that they're seeing right now is there's a tie into the people that have become ill or, actually died because of this. There's a tie into the fact that they are also consuming a liquid-based THC product. And so a lot of that right now is not being sold legally. It's being made by people, illegally, maybe in their homes, maybe in small warehouses, things like that, and then being marketed and sold to people on the streets. And the big danger with that is you just don't know what they've added in there. And one of the main things that they're identifying right now that could be an issue would be the vitamin E that they're adding into the liquid, and it's causing health concerns for some people. And so that's all kind of being shaken out right now. They haven't really found an immediate cause, but this is causing a lot of pro-marijuana or pro-cannabis people to come out and say, it's not our product, it's not from us. This is people on their own making these and selling these and things like that. And so they're trying to basically distance themselves from this press because it's coming out, and now maybe the agenda that they put out about everything is pro cannabis and cannabis is helpful to the human body, and there's been no deaths associated with cannabis, which is a big one that they generally talk about. It's starting to kind of swing a little bit, and the public is actually starting to recognize, hey, there may be some actual negative side effects to these types of things, and it may not actually be what they said it was. And so that's a big kind of thing that's happening right now.
Yes, indeed. And in the show notes for this episode, I will put a link to the most recent CDC statement regarding e-cigarettes and vaping. You mentioned a little bit about how they're prepared, how they're consumed, and the lung illness with vaping. What other dangers do you see associated with THC concentrates?
So it's slowed down quite a bit just based on the idea that more people are understanding that, hey, maybe this isn't the smartest thing in the world. And then also with the expansion of legalizing cannabis, there's more people that are actually producing this under controlled environments. But one of the dangers that we started seeing a couple of years back was the dangers developed from BHO labs, or butane hash oil labs. They essentially were calling them the new meth labs, with their propensity for explosion and danger. And this is all based off the idea that we have people that are untrained in unsupervised environments. They're not controlled environments, and we have home cooks or home chefs out there using butane as a source to isolate the chemical compound THC within the cannabis plant. And so, I've always kind of said, hey, anytime you put somebody that is potentially under the influence of a drug behind a flame and a butane source, you're asking for danger. And so some of these labs, as you would maybe expect, they were producing this THC concentrate at home, and they were utilizing the butane. And when they were using a flame to burn off the butane to leave the compound behind, or the concentrate behind, they were experiencing explosions. And so big giant explosions where houses were torn apart and apartments were blown out, all the windows were blown out, and big fireballs and things like that. And it was actually really starting to injure quite a few people. And so that's something else that people don't necessarily tie into the impact of cannabis and the expansion of cannabis use. But in Colorado, Washington, places where they were expanding the use of cannabis for recreational purposes and things like that, they were starting to see some higher intake into the burn unit at the hospital, and a lot of the public funds were having to be diverted into that area because they were spending millions of dollars that they weren't spending prior to this. It kind of boom, for lack of better words, or explosion into this market.
Yeah, so there absolutely are dangers associated with THC concentrates. And this has actually been a conversation that has come up as we've been putting on drug endangered children training throughout our region, and with our partnership, the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. Home grows, the chemicals associated with the production of THC concentrates, or even just growing, cannabis, and how that can impact children as well that are innocent bystanders when it comes to the substances. What other sort of thoughts or takeaways do you have for us?
I just kind of wanted to touch on that last point you made real quick about, people will constantly say, or one of the arguments that I hear is that weed is natural, cannabis is natural, it's a naturally occurring plant, it grows in the nature and things like that. And I think we kind of have to take a step back from that a little bit. I understand that is definitely a narrative that is wanting to be pushed by the pro-cannabis, advocates out there. But I have to remind people quite a bit that the cannabis that you're seeing now, the stuff that's being produced now, is far from natural and a plant. There's a lot of chemicals and science that goes behind developing the types of cannabis now that's developing, all the way up to 99% THC content with some of the concentrate. But even with the flower bud cannabis, you can't go out to the side of a road where we find ditch weed is what we refer to it as, but you can't go to the side of the road and find a cannabis plant growing and get 23, 25% THC content from that plant. It's just not natural. And so I I'm constantly reminding people, hey, let's take a look at where this information is coming from. And I think if I can, have one thing part from this conversation, it's that there's a lot of people out there right now that are pushing a narrative on America based on, what can be what's positive of cannabis and what are the positive aspects of cannabis and things like that. And I'm not here to say cannabis is all bad and cannabis is the worst drug that's ever been developed and, people should stop using it for X, Y, and Z and all these different things. But I am here to say that there are safer methods for ingestion of cannabis that have been developed, upwards, including like CBD. We haven't seen terrible consequences from consuming CBD. But the issue is now, because CBD became so popular, there's a lot of, illegal manufacturers of CBD that aren't following the rules when it comes to it. And so there's oftentimes a fairly high amount of THC within your CBD that you think you're consuming, just CBD. There's actually THC in there. They did studies where, we're seeing offline people selling it and things like that, and they made purchases offline. Don't quote me on this because I don't have the stuff right in front of me, but we were thinking, or I was looking at the research, and right now I'm recalling like about 20 to 30% of the products that they bought were actually what they thought they were going to be. The rest of the products that they bought actually contained a much higher dosage or concentration of THC than was reported by the company that was selling it. And so there's lots of different issues there. And so I just want people to go out and do their research, understand, what they're bringing into their body before they're doing that, get all the facts about this, and really understand how it can impact your body now and in the future, because there really haven't been any super long-term studies done on usage of cannabis, and especially with THC concentrations with what we're seeing now. The data is just not there.
I'm glad you mentioned that. As far as the data is just not there, there really isn't good long-term data, even some short-term data. There's not a lot out there. And as new peer-reviewed studies are published, stay tuned. We'll continue to put those out via our website. And I also did want to mention too, Ryan, I know you've brought up and shared some very personal stories about cannabis not being a victimless crime. And rather than to dive into those stories on this episode, I want our folks to know that Ryan was featured on the DEA's Campus Drug Prevention podcast. And there he shares one of his very personal stories about how cannabis is, in fact, not a victimless crime. So I'll put that link on our show notes as well. And it's been a delight. Thanks for sharing all of this information, and look forward to having you on future podcast episodes. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.